When it comes to learning street photography, there are two focal lengths in particular that I found to be the most helpful. And obviously, everyone's mileage differs. You can pick and choose whichever focal length suits you, but I found these two to be the most intuitive to understand, the most versatile in many situations, and accessible to most photographers. We'll be speaking mainly APS-C terms since I shoot Fujifilm, but I'll list out the full frame equivalents as well. Let's begin. The 23mm or 35 equivalent. The 23mm or 35 equivalent is my personal favorite focal length. I found this focal length to be well suited for not only street photography, but everyday and casual photography as well. It's a good mixture for someone who needs an all-purpose focal length with the option to dabble on the side. And this was the first focal length I used when I got into street photography. Let's talk about some of its pros. The pros of the 23mm. I recommend the 23mm for street photography for many reasons, one of them being its natural field of view. The 23mm and the 35mm APS-C are known to be natural field of views, which are close to what the human eye sees. Having a natural field of view allows you to translate better what you're seeing into a more relatable image for your viewer. Sure, some distinct looks can come from more wider or telephoto lenses, but we'll talk about those later. The 23mm is also slightly tighter than your average smartphone, which is commonly an 18mm, and I find this great. It's enough to make your photos look a bit different without being completely unfamiliar. It's also a great transition focal length for many beginners who are just getting started and are used to photography on their phones. Another benefit is that unlike 35mm, the 23mm is slightly wider, meaning that it's useful in situations with crowds and lots of people. You don't have to worry about getting too close, rather the opposite tends to be the problem. Because of this, it's quite easy to use this focal length not only outside, but also indoors in tight cramped places like restaurants. Similarly, when you're outside, this focal length will teach you an important street photography lesson: to move your feet. I've talked about this before, but it's a bad habit of many photographers to zoom in to get a closer shot, or shooting with a tighter lens because it's easier to get close that way than to walk. But with the 23mm, you have no choice. It's not close enough like a 35mm where you can stay at a decent distance and fire away. Rather, when I'm outside, I often find myself too far from my subjects. So this focal length forces me to get closer and step outside of my comfort zone to get better shots. I think this is an invaluable lesson for street photography, one that I deal with on a daily basis. Getting close to your subjects risks them seeing you, making for awkward stares, or just ruining the moment you were trying to capture. So although on the surface, having to get close may seem like a bad thing, it's a great teacher. It'll force you to work around these constraints and improve, and you'll get better as a result. Furthermore, I find that this focal length isn't too wide or too challenging. You could pick a wider lens and then you'll really have to move your feet, but I think that's a stretch for many beginner photographers. And this focal length will teach you the lesson without being too much for you. So those were a few pros of using the 23mm to learn street photography. Let's talk about some of its limitations. Limitations of the 23mm. When it comes to focal lengths, no single one can do it all, and the 23mm is no exception. In street photography, I find this focal length is limited by its wideness, which is ironic, I know, because we just talked about it being a pro as well. But sometimes it can be a little too wide to get the right shot. There are certain scenarios where you're just too far from your subject and you can't get to the right place fast enough, and that can be quite frustrating. It can also be a tough teacher. Some people gel better with an 18mm or 35mm, so the 23mm can be a bit awkward for them, because that's just not the way they see the world. In those cases, I'd recommend a different focal length. But you can't really know unless you try it out, right? Some people also find this focal length unappealing at times. This is because the 23mm doesn't have the full appeal of a wide lens, but it's not tight enough to have a compression that looks more professional, like the 35mm or 50mm. Personally, that's why I like it, but I understand why many people don't. It means to get a good shot with the 23mm, you are limited to certain compositions and framings. It's a bit difficult for me to describe, but there are shots I've taken where I feel restricted by the focal length and can't properly fill my frame up. But I think that's a natural outcome of using a prime lens. Again, no one lens can do it all. So although the 23mm has its limitations, it's still my favorite focal length. And if you do nail a shot where the look does shine, it's immensely satisfying. If you're having qualms, I'd say try it out. I think you could still learn a lot from it. What lenses are my options? When it comes to lenses, you have quite a few options. I shoot Fujifilm, so we'll speak about the X-mount lenses. My main lens or camera of choice for a 23mm is the X100 series cameras. These have fixed 23mm f2 lenses. Fujifilm also has a few primes of this focal length like the 23mm f2 or the 23mm 1.4. I've never owned any of these lenses since the V or the 6 have filled this role for me, but I've heard good things about them. So any one of these lenses can work for you. The 23mm f2 is probably the most budget friendly, the X100 cameras are the most compact, and the X1.4s will get you the widest aperture. The choice is yours. An honorable mention as an alternative to the 23mm is the 18mm. Some people prefer this focal length as their street photography prime of choice. I personally don't gel with the 18mm as much because it reminds me of a smartphone and it's a little too wide for my tastes. But if you prefer something wider, this focal length can teach you many of the same lessons about street photography as the 23mm and is a great alternative. 35mm or 50 equivalent. The second focal length I'd recommend to learn street photography with is the 35mm or 50 equivalent. This is also known as the Nifty 50 and it's what most people start out with. Along with the 23mm, the 35mm makes up a focal length that resembles the natural eye, so it's great for street photography. Whichever one you pick first is your choice, of course. The pros of the 35mm. There are many benefits to learning street photography with a 35mm. The first being, it's fairly easy to use. For me, coming from the 23mm, the 35mm was an awkward transition. But I've noticed that most people don't actually have a problem with it. This is because the focal length is quite easy to use. It's tighter when compared to the 23mm, so you can practice street photography without having to get too close. Furthermore, the look of a 35mm feels more professional. Its compression instantly gives it that feel that you're taking this with an actual camera, rather than the 23mm, which can sometimes be mistaken as a smartphone. Similarly, the 35mm covers what I'd call beginner mistakes. When learning street photography, there can be a lot of different things to think about, and many beginners find themselves with their hands full with the camera settings, the framing, etc. In doing so, they'll give less attention to the composition and framing of their subjects and keep unnecessary things in frame. The 35mm makes this process a whole lot easier. This is because it eliminates these unnecessary elements and subjects from your photos naturally, as it's a tighter lens than the 23mm. Whereas with a wider lens, you have to figure out how to make it work or move to a place where those unnecessary elements don't exist. These limitations of a wider lens don't exist so much with a 35mm, making it easier to frame and compose the image. And a wider lens, because it's a tough teacher, can be better to learn later. So those are the pros of the 35mm. Let's talk about its limitations. The limitations of the 35mm. When it comes to street photography, the 35mm can be a bit tight. I know this is one of the benefits we talked about with the 35mm, but every pro has its con. For the 35mm, I noticed this especially indoors. If you go to coffee shops, restaurants, etc., it can be difficult to get certain shots because the 35mm is a bit too tight. And in many of these cases, a 23mm is preferred. Also, we don't get the benefit of learning how to move our feet as we would with a wider lens. Because of its nature, the 35mm is easier to take street photos with from a distance, meaning you don't have to get as close as you do with a 23mm. This is a good thing, yes, for convenience sake, but it can also lead to bad habits. Those being less intimate photos, less incentive to move your feet, and less getting out of your comfort zone. So although the 35mm is a good focal length, it can be a crutch as well. And I find many street photographers settling into the 35mm, not wanting to experiment or play with other focal lengths because of this. The comfort zone of a 35mm is tempting and a tricky one, and if you're not careful, can limit and trap your street photography. Again, it's your preferences and your choices, but I still think it's a good idea to experiment and challenge yourself every now and then. What lenses are my options? When it comes to the X-mount system, you have a few options for a 35mm. I personally use the 33mm 1.4 and the 35mm on the 18-55 the most. But there's also an affordable 35mm f2 option as well as an older 1.4 option. You can also get the XC version if you want something cheaper. And thankfully, because this is a standard focal length, there are plenty of third-party lenses at your disposal. I think a cheaper lens is good enough to learn the focal length, and a more pricey lens is a better investment once you know you need it. Do a little digging, pick the lens that fits your budget, and get going. The 23mm and 35mm combo. As you can tell, each focal length has both pros and cons, and no one focal length can do it all. It's for this reason that I find that the combination of the two has a powerful effect. Because each focal length has its limitations, you can use one to balance the other one out. When the 23mm is too wide or difficult to use, you can use the 35mm. When you find yourself getting too comfortable or the environment is too close for a 35, you can switch to a 23mm. Furthermore, I find that these two focal lengths are the most flexible and versatile for any given environment. Whether you're out in a big city like Tokyo or just on a walk in your local neighborhood, both focal lengths work. This is why I think these two are best for learning street photography. They will teach you the fundamentals and basics without being too extreme, and they'll allow you to experiment with different types of photography without making it too foreign. From road trips to everyday hangouts, from downtown areas to little suburbs, a solid 23mm or 35mm can cover 90% of your photography. Using these two to learn photography will give you direction when you decide to branch out to more extreme focal lengths. Some photographers like including an ultra-wide or telephoto lens to their street photography kit. And although I think this can give you a unique look and appeal to your overall catalog, I wouldn't recommend this for beginners. Not only are they more challenging to use, they can be difficult to understand and see the world in a way you're not used to. These focal lengths will make more sense when you understand street photography better. You'll know if you like sitting from afar, fishing, and carefully composing a shot. And a 35mm in that case will tell you prefer something tighter. Or you'll know when you like getting close and into the mix of the crowd where the action lies. And the 23mm in that case will tell you need something wider. But don't start out with these more extreme focal lengths because you need some experience and a reference point first. And even then, an ultra wide or tight focal length will probably make up only 5 to 10% of your photography. The majority will be taken with something more standard. So, the 23mm and the 35mm. These lenses complement each other, cover each's limitations, and teaches you different things. They will teach you street photography, your preferences, and where to go next. Sometimes this may mean branching out, other times it may mean sticking to either one. I myself stick to the 23mm and use the 35 occasionally. That's what works for me. You may be different. Anyways, I hope you found this useful or helpful. If you did, please share this with a friend who could also benefit from this. And comment down below which focal length you personally prefer for street photography and why. And if you'd like to learn more photography and build a solid foundation, check out Photography Essentials. It's free. You can also help support me by adding to the travel fund or picking up a copy of my first photography zine, The Sinking Sun. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Happy shooting. I'll see you in another video. Peace.